الله رحيم الله مالك الله قدس الله.
Hey, what's up,
All
man?
right, hey.
What's up, Brian? Good to have you on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, dude. Yeah, like I told you, I read the book. There's a few things that I'm just looking a bit of clarification on. To be honest, the end part, you kind of talked about like the Christology and stuff like that. I think that Christians would more so understand that a little bit better, just as when it comes to like Islamic theology, you know, the Muslims would probably understand the more intricate details on their theological positions. But before you came in, I was actually just talking about modal collapse. You spoke about that in the book, and I remember you referenced, and there's a reference in the footnotes where you talk about it more. Do you think that anyone who holds the divine simplicity can get out of modal collapse?
No, I don't. So I've got a updated paper that I co-authored with this guy named Shannon Bird on the topic. And then I'm in this forthcoming book called Divine Simplicity: 5 Views. And so I lay out a couple different versions of the modal collapse argument, and none of my debate partners even attempted to respond to it, except for Catherine Rogers, who just says, "Yeah, modal collapse is true."
Oh yeah. No,
I think that's very telling. Yeah.
Catherine Rogers, the way
Yeah.
that she portrays his belief, she just kind of takes the entailments, and there's even some nice admissions to these issues. But yeah, no, some people say they can get out of modal collapse, but then the consequence would be providential collapse. But I don't think that anyone can get out of modal collapse. I even saw what's his name? Your discussion with the Thomas from like 6 months ago or something. Frank, I forgot his name, but I was watching that discussion, and he said,
"Oh,
that,
Cuddy, yeah,
Cuddy, yeah." He said that I was baffled. He said that God having the freedom to choose either A or B is actually an imperfection. So I was like, wow,
yeah."
if that's the case, then I don't think that anybody can get out of modal collapse unless there would be potency. I don't see any way possible that anyone who holds divine simplicity wants to say that God is absolutely timeless, he has no potency, he doesn't act successively, so on and so forth, that they can get out of this. What's up?
Yeah, I mean, I can run you through like different attempts to get out of it if you want, but yeah, they all have very serious consequences, or they just don't work.
Yeah, I heard one of them was providential collapse would be the consequence of getting out of modal collapse, and that one's probably much worse than the modal collapse itself. But you also, we can get into that, but also you spoke about B theory of time, because we as Muslims, we hold the position of we would lean towards A theory. We completely believe that God acts successively, his actions are temporal, so on and so forth. So I remember in the paper you mentioned B theory. There's different views. I was wondering if there's any view which doesn't entail that all moments would be pretty much the same for God, past, present, and future.
Yeah, so you could have, so the B theory is supposed to refer to this view called eternalism, whereas like, yeah, all moments of time on the timeline equally exist. But you could have, like, you've got presentism, which says only the present moment exists, and they usually affirm an A theory. And then you've also got this growing block view where the past and the present are equally exist, but the future doesn't. And those people usually affirm the A theory, but you'll find some people say they affirm the B theory there. And then you've got this crazy view called like the shrinking block, where it's like the future and the present exist, but the past doesn't exist. No one actually affirms that view. It's just a crazy view that philosophers are just like, well, for the sake of completeness, we should talk about it. I'm like, no one affirms this crazy stuff. You guys are wasting your time. The moving spotlight. Yeah, go ahead.
My question is to you. Do you think that accepting modal collapse is a defeater, or is it just something that is very unintuitive?
It could go either way. So it depends on your theological system. So if in your theological system you have the claim that God is free to create or not create, then the modal collapse is going to be a complete defeater.
Okay.
Yeah. If in your philosophical system you've got the claim that there are contingent facts in the world, there's some sort of contingency in the world, well, then it's going to be a defeater. If you're just like, everything's necessary, well, then you don't have a defeater, because you're like, well, yeah, everything's necessary.
Yeah,
it's just wildly intuitive. That's, yeah.
Yeah, I personally think it's both. I think it's a defeater. I think that's counterintuitive as well. I don't see any Abrahamic faith compatible with modal collapse. So,
do you hold to EED specifically, or do you just reject ADS?
I don't know what the essence energy distinction is supposed to be. So in the forthcoming Divine Simplicity 5 Views debate book, we have David Bradshaw in there trying to defend this essence energy distinction. And he keeps throwing around like ineffable mystery. And I don't know, you can't know anything about an ineffable mystery because it's unknowable. It's unspeakable. And yet he's able to write 20 pages on this unspeakable thing and this unknowable thing. So my only response to him is to just say, like, ye know too much about something you can't know anything about. So what is this? Whereas on my view, in the attributionist view, you see in like Al-Maturidi and Al-Ghazali and others, is that, yeah, God has attributes. It's really obvious. And his actions are not identical to his existence, because what on earth could that possibly mean? So there's no mystery. It's just really intuitive. You're straightforward. You're done. I don't need some ineffable, mysterious EE distinction.
Okay, I have a question. What do you think if the if the DDS proponents, like if the Thomas is going to say that there's going to be some sort of like distinction, or like the effect does not necessarily follow from the cause, or like they're like kind of like affirming the indeterministic link, but they're saying that they're not affirming the indeterministic link.
Yeah, so this would be a case where these contemporary Thomists are just wildly inconsistent with Aquinas himself, because Aquinas affirms the infallibility of omnipotence. So if God wants X to come about, then X will in fact come about.
Hello.
Yeah, what's up?
Dr. Ryan Mullins. I'm not sure if you remember, but remember last summer you got invited to this like Muslim server with like 20K members, and then there was a co-host.
Yeah.
That was me.
Ah, yeah. Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, doing all right. Yeah, I'm in Scotland at the moment.
That's
last year I would have been in.
I don't know. I have a lot of questions to ask you now. It's not like the audience. But by the way, funnily enough, I did want to debate Khalil on his because I went through like a phase of classical theism to neoclassical theism. Yeah. I was like, I don't know, I got my debater phase, and I was like, Khalil, let's debate on like your trash composition argument from the medieval century. Yeah. And I don't know, he's disappeared. I don't know, he privated his Twitter. He's depressed now. I don't know. I can't find him anywhere, which is a shame.
I don't know.
But the thing is, I wanted to talk to you about something. So my first intriguing, look, I have this sort of hermeneutic of Aquinas. I'm not sure if this is academically founded or not, but I believe you're going to find it interesting because I did. So you know how Aquinas says these creatures are necessary through another, but God is necessary through itself. And that is like the response to modal collapse. Some issues. First of all, in modal collapse, you conceded that already because we're talking about modal semantics. It's either the case that it obtains in all worlds or not. If it does, we don't care about the ontology there, about like, is it self-existent or not? First of all, modal semantics, and like there's something called existential predicativist ontologies. Existential predicativist ontologies are ontologies where you can say stuff like pure existence, self-explained, or whatever. But these things are alien in analytic philosophy, completely alien, and they're redundant and they're incoherent at times with the semantics of first order logic and so on. So when people give that response, to me, that's a concession to modal collapse. That's number one. Number two, the way Aquinas phrases these things, how is this different from Avicenna saying everything is necessary through another except God, who's necessary through himself. And they both agree on this semantics of pure existence. So this is my hermeneutic of Aquinas, is that he was a closeted necessitarianism. If I brought up Aquinas to the stage and I told him, do I obtain in all worlds, but I'm essentially contingent, he would say yes.
Yeah, no.
What do you think?
See, you're not the only one to say this. So Norman Kretzmann, who was a very important Thomistic scholar, he passed away. It was like early 2000s, I think. He co-authored a bunch of stuff with Eleanor Stump. So he's got his commentary on Aquinas and some papers he's done. He points out that Aquinas is deeply inconsistent on this point, that Aquinas has these moments in his writings where he wants to give God the freedom of choice to do A or not A. And then Aquinas has these other moments where he just goes full on necessitarianism. And Arthur Lovejoy, I'm reading through his The Great Chain of Being, which was written in like the early 1900s during his William James lectures at Harvard. And he says the exact same thing. And I could give you loads of other examples, but yeah, this is a thing that lots of different Thomist scholars have pointed out, that Aquinas sometimes just goes full necessitarian.
That's very, that's very profound.
Massively.
Because that is an analytic philosophy. When we say necessitarianism, we mean the semantics of modal semantics. That's what we care about. It's either the case that this proposition is true in all worlds or not. That is it. We don't care about some sort of ontology that pertains to like existential predicativism or not. That is not our interest. So if that is true of Aquinas, then he was a necessitarian, because that's what it means to be necessitarian in these discourses.
Yeah. So
But
you will find passages.
With hermeneutic, or do you agree?
Well, so I think I would disagree, because I think Aquinas says both things. He contradicts himself, which he does a lot.
Because the Catholic Church does say if you negate freedom of God, that's anathema. I remember reading that.
Yeah. And so you see Aquinas trying to avoid the necessity and failing miserably, and then other times just kind of embracing it, and then other times he's like, no, let's go back. So you see all of that in Aquinas, and he's not the only one, but yeah. So the other point you're making too, though, about like, creatures are necessary, but they're not necessary in their own existence. They're necessary through another. That's just changing the topic. So anybody who brings that up, you're just like, so you got a modal collapse, and now you want to go, well, I don't exist, I'll say. And I'm like, well, that's not the point. Who cares?
Exactly, yeah. And you know what's my argument against that? Is that, first of all, this through another in itself semantics, like I pointed out, it's only consistent with existential predicative ontologies, and those are alien and completely incoherent under first order logic semantics. So let's say somebody gives this like tweak to FOL, and like somehow does this like change to what existential quantifier does, or introduces another notion of existence and does all that nonsense. That comes at a very hefty cost. So you could do like a modus tollens. If Thomism is true, then existential predicativist ontology is true. But it is not the case that existential predicativist ontology is true, therefore Thomism is not true. Or like you can add anything to a modal collapse argument against like any theist. And this like theistic necessitarianism view of like Asiri or whatever, you can just point out like it just bloats your ontology way too much, to the point you can deny it based on the costs of the consequent.
No, that seems really plausible to me. I mean, I don't know enough about semantics because I've not studied that in a long time, but that sounds really plausible to me.
Yeah, that's my go-to argument whenever like an Ibn Sina dude or whatever pulls up and says, well, I say in this sense, and like, and all that nonsense. I'm like, bro, you just bloated your ontology to like no virtue. Like, what are we giving up when I'm like not accepting this stuff? Nothing. So you're not fixing the solution, you're just adding stuff.
Yeah, adding lots of undesirable things. Yeah.
So I wanted to talk to you about something else. Let me think. There's a lot of things. So look, I have this sort of argument against, I have a lot of issues with DDS, but what do you think of this? Which is that, you know, the dichotomy of stance independently true and like stance dependently true.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen some different ways to articulate it, but keep going.
Yeah, so DDS proponents typically they would say omniscience is meaningless, stands independently, because they have to. That's just the consequent. And if that's the case, and omniscience is meaningless, stands independently, that means omniscience is not stands independently true, because prior to the consideration of the mind, you cannot cataphatically predicate God with omniscience. You can only do that in like conceptual semantics, in an intentional context. If that's the case, you're gonna be prompted with this counterintuitive position where you have to say it is the case that God is not stands independently omniscient, which is really, really awkward to say.
That is weird.
But what do you think?
Because I guess, okay, I'm not bothered by the idea that like omniscience has to mean from God's perspective. Because I don't think omniscience is the real perfection. I think there's something deeper. So the power to know.
Yeah, I understand. But this can be
stuff,
switched up for any property of God, any omniproperty.
Like all of them would not be stance. They would all have
All
to
of them
come
would
from a
not be
stance.
stance independently true. Yeah, because of the equivalency relation, they just lose their meaning. They just mean God, predicate God. That's it.
Yeah. So they all come from a stance. What would be the problem with saying that?
Oh, it's
I think I'm
just
missing something.
The implication there would be like most theists would like take the assumption that it is stance independently true that God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent. Now, if that fails to hold, you get an inconsistent. You can draw an inconsistency there.
Again, I think I'm missing something about the semantics here. So if it's stance independent that God is all the omnis, then what's the inconsistency? That they're all meaningless?
That is not stance independently all these omni properties.
Okay. So if I say they are stance independent, or they are stance dependent, what would be the problem there?
The problem is that we assume they're stance independently true. And that's the normative theistic position. That's my point. It's more so like based on the norm. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to strike like a metaphysical absurdity. Rather, like it'll be an absurdity of like, well, don't you think, when we speak of God this way and whatever, it's obviously reflecting it like a stance independent true. It picks out something stance independently true. We're not talking about fictional items or like fictional, fictitious predicates now. Mm-hmm. So if that is assumed, it'll be really counterintuitive for the day-to-day person to say like, oh, these omni properties, they're stance dependent.
Yeah, no, I get that. It would be weird to be like, well, we all think it is this way. Yeah, so this is supposed to be a problem just for like the omnis in general, or if omnis when combined with simplicity?
Omnis when combined with simplicity, of course. I believe omnis, in my view, in my view, I don't know. I'm agnostic on whether or not I commit to a constituent ontology or relationist, or I don't know. I'm agnostic on all of that, but I can defend my creed either or. I don't care.
Yeah, no, I understand because I go back and forth.
Are you a constituent of ontology?
I go back and forth on that issue as well. But yeah, you're right. If all the predicates are just like, well, it's just God, so God, and you're like, oh, cool. And all your talk about God becomes meaningless quite quickly. And so you've just found another way to articulate it.
But as for metaphysical absurdities, though, I do have more issues. By the way, I remember this is a really good point you pointed out. And that is, given how we treat properties as like, just something that picks out what's true of the subject, and we assume God has no properties, you're going to have some performative contradiction of saying he has the property of having no properties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
By the way, I use that a lot. Because
I started using it a lot more.
The semantics of DDS not being compatible with like modern day analytic semantics at all. It's literally two different worlds.
It really is outrageous, but I'm not the first person to point this out. I mean, this is like in the Modality tradition. It's going like you're denying God's attributes. So yeah, but like it's something I've started using a lot more. And people get like when I'm doing it live, and I can like in a seminar room, the looks on people's faces, they get so angry, and I'm just like, yeah, it's the attribute that says God has no attributes. I know that sounds like a straw man, but it's perfectly accurate and backed by real scholarship, so you can't tell me I'm wrong. And then like the face just goes back to being like, okay, I can't be mad now. But it's that split second where everybody's like really angry. It's very funny.
Yeah, exactly. There's that. I mean, for the other issues I have, first of all, pure existence is not compatible with like existence being a quantifier. And existence being a quantifier is like, it's one of those rare times where there's actually a consensus of philosophy. So giving up that for the cost of like accepting what pure existence is already like insane to me. So that's number one. Number two, it's like, there's obviously like the hermeneutics of what it means for a, like I'll group them all together, like the property and subject issue there under those semantics, like having the property of having no properties identical to an abstracta. And even if you say properties are concrete, by the way, you don't want to say God is identical to a constituent, a concrete constituent either. So it doesn't escape the issue if you say the property is concrete. So I don't know why people make that dumb claim, because you're trying to say God is neither constituted nor a constituent. He's not apt to mereological relations or constitutive relations at all. Not part of or has parts. So that's one thing. And there's also, I can't make sense of an absolutely simple being having intentional states. That's one.
I don't. I mean, there's a lot of attempts to do it, but every time I read an attempt to figure it out, William Aston, who has the non-propositional omniscience stuff. Yeah, that was a very technical point in epistemology. So one of his students, Gregory Gansel, tried to pick that up to use to defend divine timelessness. And I was chatting with Greg. It was 2 years ago at a conference, and he was trying to bring it out again to defend that view. And I was like, I don't know what this really means. And I just asked him a few questions, and he quickly goes, I feel like I don't know what it means anymore either. And I'm like, this was your PhD dissertation way back in the day. Like, what do you mean?
Exactly. There's ambiguity on that part. But thing is, ambiguity can be deemed subjective because, like, the semantic capture off of something is like, at the end of the day, it's like subjective. Thing is, you could like sort of like give a robust argument by saying like, if you introduce a new type of like knowing things, knowing propositions, and this new type, because remember, you have to keep in mind, an ontology is bloated if and only if a new type is introduced. Mm-hmm. So if you introduce a new type, and it's like explanatorily dispensable, that lowers your priors a lot.
It so should.
Already, like, and by the way, I make this point a lot with DDS about like the parsimony stuff, because it introduces, like, bro, when you go up to me an a-spatial-temporal being that atemporally causes and is like identical to all of its property, I don't even know what's being there. And at the end of all of that, you still have the audacity to say that's an intentional agent with freedom, bro. Come on now. Like,
I know.
Like that. And I spoke to somebody about this. This argument is so powerful and easy to the point you can paraphrase it to like, well, pure existence is like, for pure existence to be even like intelligible, it's parasitic on Aristotelian potentia. It is not the case, Aristotelian potentia. Therefore, pure existence is not the case. I mean, actus pure, sorry. It's as easy as that. Literally, it's as easy as that. And potency realism, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe anybody takes that seriously anymore.
You get a few randoms here or there, but I don't know how you
really about the formal ontology stuff. Because, are you familiar with formal ontology?
It's been a long time since I've been looking at some of this stuff.
Yeah, but basically the rundown is like, you just apply like formal systems onto like how you have ontological commitments, but there will be no ontological commitments. Actually, they will be completely negated. And this is a position popular between expressivists and global constructivists like Carnap and so on. Okay. I actually took inspiration of their account of change there, because they literally say, obviously I disagree with global constructivists and expressivists because they negate anything metaphysical. God exists as a metaphysical claim. So obviously we disagree there. But their account of change, what inspired me is that change is so redundant and trivial that it just can be expressed by like the semantics of FOL. Like predicate true, not true in a temporal notion. That is it. And if somebody says, what's going on there? Okay, I moved my muscle. Oh, them explanations not deep. I don't even know what deep explanations are. It's why these like, it's why this stuff is like so like, I'm not even trying to be demeaning, but it's like why thrown out the bin for like more of over a century now.
There's these different time periods in the history of philosophy where I just cannot empathize with what was going on. So when I look at a lot of these logical positivists and they're just throwing everything out the window as meaningless, I maybe it's because I'm already corrupted by knowing the incoherence there, but I just go, how did any of you get suckered into this? Because this is just so obviously absurd. But what it demonstrates is like how much fashion trends play a huge role in the history of ideas. So it really isn't about arguments.
100%. And by the way, the reason why, well, you're familiar with like a lot of the Muslim discourses. The reason why when I made that switch between like, well, when I've only been into philosophy for like a year and a half. And I started off as like, well, I'm not even formally trained. I just like go off of these discourses. Thing is, and I sort of like, I got introduced by this like Ed Phaser, Kuhn's type of rhetoric at first, the fiddle religion basic stuff. Then I ventured out even more and more deep. And thing is, what I realized is that the issue there is that a lot of these problems, sort of like quote unquote problems, they point out, like the classical theist side, it's sort of like, oh, assume my system and this is a problem. And the thing is, their system is dependent on like their very their very emphasis on metaphysics. Yeah. And you know how analytic philosophy treats metaphysics. So I was sort of in this like doubting phase. And when I left classical theism, and then I wanted a creed that doesn't emphasize on dogmatic metaphysics, because I believe the Ash'aris and Maturidis do that too with their whole atomism stuff and whatever.
So I wanted got various metaphysical stuff here. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted a creed that's not dogmatic about their metaphysical commitments. And the Taymi creed was something so profound and excellent about that with regards to that. Especially, well, I'm assuming you're familiar with them. You know, Jamie Turner's works on Reformed Epistemology and like Ibn Taymiyyah's tweak to it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really great. That's something you can find in the Taymi sort of discourse that you'd struggle to find outside of like, well, you can find in Protestant Christianity and analytic philosophy, of course, but outside of that, nothing else. Because that's what I was searching for, something that is not dogmatic about metaphysics.
Because that's the thing is when you're looking at a lot, especially like you're right with Phaser and Kuhn's, they are so dogmatic about the metaphysics and their rhetoric just far outstrips the arguments they have for them, because they are just assuming you just have to take this very particular brand of metaphysics as just the obvious truth, and everything that violates it, well, that's just got to go. And then Phaser also, he just makes up stuff about his opponents. I have a paper that just came out called What if Drew Johnson is Right? The Implications of Hebraic Philosophy for Systematic Theology. And at the end of the paper, I just point out this huge like set of outright lies that Phaser says about anybody who rejects classical theism. And I just list all, like he says, classical theism is the only model of God that takes God's ultimacy to be regulative. And then I just start citing a dozen people.
That's why.
Exactly.
Dude, you can believe in a super apophatic conception of God just without accepting simplicity. I mean, simplicity in that sense.
Yeah. Exactly. You could. Well, so what I do is I just go.
I know you're in academic circles, but look, Phaser. We know about Phaser, and I know you're smiling when you heard me say that. Look,
I do. Know. Yeah, because that guy's he can't stop gaslighting. I'm just amazed.
We know. Look, listen. A 20-year-old Joe Schmidt gave him the circles. So we all know.
Yeah. I love it. Absolutely love it.
Oh, by the way, I did speak to Joe Schmidt once because he's friends with Venus, and Venus is my close friend too.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I used to hang around these circles a lot.
Yeah, Joe, I used to chat with Joe quite a lot, but since he started grad school, he's been very, very busy, which is very understandable.
Yeah, he's pretty young too. It's crazy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
There's also, what else to say? I think we covered the classical theism part. I mean, this isn't an attack on classical theism, but There's stuff like atemporal causation, which I find gibberish, and
Yeah. So there's
even something being like aspatial, I still find hard to like conceive. I can definitely obviously abstract is I don't have an issue. Like there's no ambiguity there, but concrete as being aspatial and having like spatial causal relations, that's something hard to conceive.
It's a weird one. And so Robert Pasnaw, he's an expert on medieval philosophy, and he says nobody wanted to deny, or no one wanted to really say that God was aspatial until you get to kind of like Descartes' era. And I don't know if that's true of the Islamic tradition, but in the Christian tradition, I think he has a really good argument for that, because you do see like these kind of claims that God takes up space, like they just if
like
you don't know what you're looking for,
it's like the intuitive part of it. A lot of things, but like the robust criticisms didn't really come along until like the 19th, 18th century. That's where we were but the intuition was definitely founded. And that's exactly what I mean. By the way, that's exactly what I mean about dogmatic metaphysics, because it held a lot of these people back for more than centuries.
I think so. And what's funny is if you read through a lot of early modern philosophy, they want to reject a lot of the dogmatic, like scholastic metaphysics, but they don't reject everything, and they still have a lot of these hangovers of these different kinds of problems that they still inherit because they don't get rid of all of it.
Them back. That's the issue. And because there's one thing about these arguments against DDS, and there's another thing about like, you know, just the sort of dogma you have around these like systems. It's gonna set you back because, you know, you're gonna enter a space as robust as analytic philosophy that are really, some of them are really like eliminativist about like metaphysics at times, like Carnap. And one phase of Putnam and other people that are like deflationary, like Hugh Price and Thomas and contemporaries and so on. And what are you going to do there? You know, you're going to be stuck with dogma and so on. You're not going to have robust responses because you're trying to keep it as minimalistic as possible in a response to them. Like I can respond to them pretty fine because what I have to defend, some realist notion about metaphysical explanations, some correspondence links whenever something sometimes is true synthetically. And that's about it. I'm pretty done there. Well, they have to introduce much more stuff.
That's what's kind of shocked me, because there's been a renaissance of metaphysics as a whole. I mean, since the 1970s, and then a lot of renaissance of sort of neo-Aristotelian ideas.
Yeah, definitely, with Schaffer, Fine, and so on.
Yeah, and what's funny is a lot of the Thomists get really excited about that to a point because they're like, "Well, look, everybody just agrees with us."
Those are not your guys.
Like,
those are
exactly.
Not your guys.
Yeah.
No, that's not what the Renaissance is talking about at all. Those are not your guys. You know the amount of times people just see neo-Aristotelian and get excited. I just see essentialism and get excited. With all due respect, that's just ignorance if you think like they're in the same boat. Because neo-Aristotelianism and classical Aristotelianism or Thomistic Aristotelianism are as closely related to each other as Frege Platonism and Plotinus' Platonism are. It's just lip service. That is it. And this is why I can tell you, you know how people say like Frege and other people that are Platonists, they call them little p Platonists.
Right.
They're little p Platonists and all that. And the classical ones, they're called big P. That's what I do with the neo-Aristotelians and the classical ones. Little a Aristotelian, big A Aristotelian. These little a Aristotelians, when you talk to them about grounding, first of all, it's non-causal. Jonathan Schaffer literally argues for the universe to be like the reason as to why it obtains. And he argues as to why all metaphysical explanations, causal or not, they are always going to yield a regress. Only and only until you say something is brute. Fine believes these essences are, even though he negates modal essentialism, he still believes they're non-causal. The grounding is like hyper-intentional, not extensional, like Thomas are trying to say. There's such in different boats, and their positions are actually mutually exclusive, but they don't realize it because the words there are being equivocated, and it's a buzzword to say these things.
Yes, that was my experience, because when I was doing my PhD, I was reading through a lot of metaphysics textbooks just to try to figure everything out. And then I was hanging around a bunch of these physicists and these Catholics who were really excited about, we got to bring back like Thomism, and like, oh, this new like neo-Aristotelian stuff. I'm like, it's miles away from what you guys want. Which
exactly, it's just
I'm
lip
happy
service.
with, but
It's just lip service, as like Frege, Gödel, or even Quine with his mathematical Platonism. Like, it's just called Platonism for the label, but they have nothing in common.
yeah,
Beyond like the realism part.
yeah. I mean, that really is it. It's just they both are like, yeah, there's some stuff that's abstracted that are out there.
Yeah, that's one thing that has to be
there.
pointed out. And I don't know, it's just a buzzword. Like, oh, this term is like closely affiliated with us, and like he subscribed to this term, therefore like we're in the same boat. It's really cringe.
It is.
Thing is, by the way, I wanted to ask you. You probably got this a lot. Why don't you become a Taymi Muslim yourself?
I mean, I only got introduced to Ibn Taymiyyah. When was this? There was this God and Time conference in Vienna in 2018.
Oh, that's ironic.
Yeah. So we had John Hoover. Yeah, I know. Yeah, so I only found out about him then, and John Hoover, because John Hoover was speaking there, and so yeah, and so I started studying him a little bit more since then. So I found him interesting, but it's just I'm such an amateur at his thought.
Yeah, but I don't know. I would love you to become a Taymi though, because I told you my experience. I wanted something that's not dogmatic about metaphysics and explores theism through the lens of epistemology and language, which is why you can find so many papers about like Ibn Taymiyyah, Wittgenstein, or like there's that like sort of like infamous paper, and there's like Jamie Turner's work about reformed epistemology, and you know how Planting is the most celebrated theist into these like in these analytic discourses, and that's something I really find profound when you strike similarities like that. So that's why I believe like it's the best theist position ever, and that's why I really like take pride in it, and that's why like I sort of subscribe to this position afterwards.
Yeah, so I talk about him in one of my recent books, From Divine Time Maker to Divine Watchmaker, because when I'm trying to look at different accounts of divine temporality, so I talk about Ibn Taymiyyah there, because he's an example of someone who thinks God does one thing and then another, and then he's got this doctrine of eternal creation, and so I wanted to look at some of his arguments on that issue. So I thought he was really interesting, but he's just one of a million people I was reading to try to get that book just finished. So yeah.
But I'm saying I'm offering more than just like negating atemporality. I'm saying like the sort of treatment to like dogmatic metaphysics, the sort of treatment to like scripturalism, the sort of treatment to like epistemology and language, and so on and so forth. That's my point.
Yeah. So I don't know how much of his stuff is translated into English, because I know there's people working on that project to translate more of his stuff in English. So I've only been able to access like a few things. Some people have sent me some of the books that have been translated that were like on creation and God and creation, because that was my main interest at the time.
But I would love for you to become a Taymi Muslim someday.
Maybe we'll
great, bro. Trust me, it's the new wave now.
Yeah, one thing that you mentioned is you weren't sure if like any of the Muslims pre-René Descartes held the view that God was like a-spatial and all of this.
Because I don't know the tradition enough.
Yeah. So the earliest Muslims, they actually held that God was like spatial. God is a spatial entity. He's located above the throne. He acts successively, so on and so forth.
Then post third century, this sort of like explosion happened, and this only happened because there were these like influences between like Muslim Christian polemics, and Christians, they were heavy Platonists at that time, like Augustine and so on, and they inherited that tradition, and some Muslims picked up from the like the metaphysics being reiterated around there. So that's why you can find post third century after polemics like, oh, God is timeless, God is simple, God is this, God is that.
Yeah, that's the thing, and it wasn't just picking it up. They literally, like the Mu'tazila had Christian teachers, so they learned the stuff from them.
But you know what the funny thing is? I'm assuming that you know Sean Anthony, right? Obviously, I disagree with Sean Anthony's hermeneutics of Islam.
Except
But
at
he-
one point.
Yeah, he even says the same thing, and he says like the Quran's authorial intent is obviously anthropomorphic, which is funny. And you know who got mad at that? Khalil Adnani did.
Yeah, for sure. For sure he would. You know, even when it comes to things like knowledge, you know, God's knowledge, they have propositional knowledge. Is there any kind of thing that's gained with the state of affairs changing? You mentioned that Aquinas in your book, he had like a contradictory view. I don't know if he did, because you mentioned that he contradicted himself before at other times, but in this instance, it seems like he had a quite similar view to Avicenna, where God doesn't know the particular. Is that right?
Well, so yes and no. So Aquinas sees the problem that if God knows the particulars, like what's happening right now, well, then God's knowledge is going to change, so God can't be timeless. And you see someone like Augustine go, who cares? He just doesn't know what's happening right now. And you're like, whoa. You're like, my goodness, all right. And Aquinas is really bothered by that, because he's like, well, if I know what's happening right now and God doesn't, then I know something God doesn't know. And surely I can't know something the omniscient Lord does not know. Like, you know, so he's bothered by it, and he tries to find a way to get the knowledge of the particular, but he fudges. And there's a lot of kind of throwing around hands to obscure things, which is something Aquinas does every now and then. And what he ends up saying is God knows what's happening right now because he knows the cause, which is himself. So he knows himself. So there you go. And you're like,
Yeah,
well,
but that's a cope. What? Like I know
It
how
is.
flowers are made. Therefore, like when the flower is made up, I know how it looks like. Yes, that's a cope.
It is a cope, and the further issue is you've got within Aquinas' thought, God is causally sustaining what's happening right now. So you still have this issue of like, okay, so God's sustaining right now.
They were presentists. That's
Exactly.
I believe everybody was a presentist before like general relativity.
Yes. So Emily Thomas at Durham, she's working on a history of philosophy of time right now, and that's one of her big ideas is presentism was just not questioned in the Western world until kind of like early 20th century.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Actually, funnily enough, is that I don't know. I have issues with presentism, but like in the dialectic, I uphold it for like convenience sake. But my issue definitely stems from like the works of physics, because I did argue this before, and I tagged you on Twitter, but you didn't see it. I don't know, tagged no one. But it was something like so I can just paraphrase it to like there are gravitational waves, and these gravitational waves have non-zero Weyl curvature. And if they do have that, that means there's only a 4 more dimensional world. And if that's the case, presentism is false. And that's my primary issue with presentism. It stems from like the advancements of like what we have discovered through the lens of like general relativity and so on.
Yeah, I'm not bothered by these sort of arguments anymore because physics is so incredibly broken. We know that not all of the theories are true because they don't fit together. And so like Jeff Kapersky, the way he talks about it is physics is this completely broken like patchwork, and we don't know how they fit together. So you have to go anti-realist on something somewhere. The question is we don't know what. And depending on which physicist you ask, you'll get a completely different answer.
Consensus. I mean, there are some things that try to work everything together. That's like the things about like the cosmos and the string theory and stuff. And obviously like the interpretations of quantum mechanics. But there are physicists that are really sort of like passionate about like the discoveries. And once you get into like the hermeneutics of like the physics discoveries of like, for example, QM, it's either deterministic or indeterministic. And that plays with the theory of time too, because I believe either view is going to be problematic to presentism.
I don't know, because so I examined a PhD dissertation on David Bohm's deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics, and one of the things that the student argued is that this is like perfectly consistent with presentism. I've seen other views like do the same thing, but I don't know how seriously to take quantum mechanics. So I was reading this interview with I think the guy's name is like Duhassel or something. It was in Scientific America like just a couple of weeks ago. And so he's like a really big deal in physics, and he's just like coming to the end of his career because he's about to retire. And he's just like, yeah, this whole field's nuts. All of it's crazy. Like, we're not really talking about reality. And just getting some useful predictions, that's it. And anybody who takes it more seriously.
Like,
is
I
like,
don't take either. I do find more virtue in the deterministic explanation, because there's no wave function collapse in the Schrodinger equation. You just add that in, and that's how you do the indeterministic one. So I do find more virtue, but I don't believe in either. It's because I do believe they conflict with theism. The reason why I say presentism would have issues with deterministic interpretation is that the deterministic explanation is going to say they're already determined, even if they're probabilistic. The probabilistic is going to be explained by like an interpretation called many worlds. So it's going to be something like, if I jump off a wall, or like if I jump off my bed or something, me failing to jump off and like land and like I fall, or like me like successfully landing, whatever, either or. The probability assessor is talking about the actual world, the state of affairs there. It's not talking about like, it's not going to negate either explanation is going to be real, because me jumping off the wall, me failing to land, or me landing, they're both equally real, but just in different worlds. And those worlds are equally real. That is where the tension of presentism comes in, with the many worlds interpretation. And
I mean,
that's not
it could
only
be
a tension with, thing is, what I have a problem too, it's not only a tension with presentism, it's also a tension with other theistic norms, like causality. How do you understand it there? How do you understand omniscience? Not omniscience. How do you understand theism there? Because what is God going to judge? A million Viennas? We don't understand what's happening.
So I mean, you can have a presentist world, like a world in like the maximal sense, and have all these different universes and all that kind of stuff. It gets a little bit weird, but people even in like the scientific revolution were like, yeah, maybe this is a way you could do it. So Pierre Gassendi, who influenced Newton, was like, yeah, you could have like a bunch of different worlds, and there's all this like this universal time for them. There's been a bunch of people who have done theistic multiverse stuff. So Mike Almeida.
I've looked into that once. I was like going to the interpretation stuff, but
it gets weird.
That's like, remember what I said about adding stuff is not a solution. It's just open. That's what I feel is happening there.
So
like somebody pulling up is like, and determinism is fine with theism. Why? Because God is the observer and God is outside of us and God created. Or what? Bro, you're yapping. Like you're just destroying what the interpretation is.
It gets crazy really fast, and I used to have a lot of patience for it because I didn't know how to think about any of this stuff. So I was reading like everything on theistic multiverses years ago. Now I'm just like, I think the multiverse is crazy, and I don't feel inclined to take it seriously.
Yeah, but the veil curvature stuff is why I have an issue with presentism, and I do believe like the premise is going to be like that premise is it's going to stand, because the sort of like it hinges on what do you say, like general relativity and other discoveries, and those things are like empirically tested, like they're successful. GPS is literally work because of general relativity. I think that's like a long discourse. Hold on, somebody said, what do you and Ryan Mullins think about tag? Whether they've been asking you a lot about that. Tag.
Okay, here's the thing. Everybody just wants me to just dump all over the argument. I have said multiple times, I just have never really understood what is happening with these transcendental arguments. So as best as I can tell, when you make a transcendental argument, you're just like, well, I need God to make sense of reality.
And then I'm interrupting. You can go on.
Yeah, so you say I need God to make sense of reality, and you're like, okay, cool, show it. And then well, I don't need to. But then the way the conversation always goes is people start giving very standard arguments for you need God for this, this, and this. You start just doing explanatory power theism stuff. So you're just back to standard natural theology. So I don't know what the tag is really doing.
Exactly. And I'm going to tell you my issue with tag. well, not necessarily tag, but the dialectic. It's like you sort of get this Van Til, J. Dyer rhetoric of like they attack other natural theology theists. Oh, how dare you use metaphysics and it has to be grounded in this and whatever. And they do this to some atheists too. It has to be grounded and so on. And sometimes it shares similarities with like constructivists and expressivists attacking metaphysics. But that camp is consistent, while the tag camp tells you, why are you doing metaphysics? The conclusion is more metaphysics, which is just gibberish. Very, 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 well, I'm not trying to be demeaning, but it's very stupid. I mean, I know you can see like that jump being very idiotic.
It's a weird one, and I've seen it in different time periods surrounding different kinds of apologetic strategies, and it's one I'm just not particularly attracted to myself.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Van Til one, there's the Dyer one, and all of them, they're all really, it's like not interesting. It begs the question. I don't know, you can do much better. For me, tag, I just take it to be a meme argument that just blew up, and like beyond that, it's like I don't give much attention to it.
He more said pedals ignorant.
Thing is, I used to, well, funnily enough, I used to have alt accounts and I used to troll tag proponents, and I used to call this argument like, oh, the like the Vienna argument against tag. And what this would be called, like, oh, the set of all thought objects that can be quote unquote eternal, you could replace that with whatever conception of God that's like the conclusion of tag. So let's talk about it like an eternal banana. That's the precondition of all intelligibility. We have intelligibility, therefore eternal banana.
No, you can't. Any other non-Christian worldview would deny
like
one or more.
this guy's a meme. This guy's a meme.
I'm not a meme, dude.
This guy on Clubhouse, everybody moves on him. I know this guy. Look, we're trying to have a serious
This
conversation.
is your argument is just poisoning.
Don't invite up P-Mars. P-Mars, I know him from Clubhouse. He's like
He said it doesn't work with the non-Christian worldview. I was like, what?
yeah, bro. That guy's a troll.
Oh, okay.
That guy runs one of the many argument like in 2025. Don't bring him up. I'm not trying to like ruin the panel by inviting him. But P-Mars, you can come up here after.
Yeah, after. When it comes to, you remember I asked you about B theory earlier, Ryan?
Oh yeah.
When it comes to B theory, I know there's the eternalist approach, and then I read about you talk about like four-dimensional eternalism and all that. As for my position as a Muslim, the position that I hold and the position that any Muslim would hold is not all moments would be the same for God. So under B theory, would you say that B theory of time would result into all moments being reduced to the same?
Not exactly. So this is a problem with a lot of the older discussions around the B theory of time and God's relationship to time before my book came out, because everybody was ignoring the details of the B theory or of eternalism. So eternalism says like all these moments are equally real, they equally exist, but there is succession, there is change in the world, and there is supposed to be a direction to the arrow of time in the world. So they are not all simultaneous. The moments are not simultaneous. They just all eternally exist. And so because a lot of people who defend divine timelessness, they just missed those details. They're just like, oh, well, it all exists at once for God. And it's like, there is no at once here. All those moments eternally exist, but they're in their respective temporal locations, their respective successive ordering relations of earlier and later than and all that. And these are real temporal, it's a theory of time, so it really is time. So I think the mistake that was happening in a lot of the discussions before my book came out was that people were taking the B theory of time to be a theory of timelessness. And I was able to convince Paul Helm, actually, of this point. So he does a more recent paper in 2019 where he goes, yeah, tenseless, B theory, these are theories of time, and so we need to acknowledge that you can't talk about God like exactly the same way as we often did in the past, if we really want God to be timeless. So I think there's just a confusion there.
Yeah, because what we don't want to do is make, obviously the creation eternal, like in the DDS view. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of what my concern with B theory was.
Okay, no, that's a different concern. So that's an important concern, because if you do go with this B theory view, Yeah, with eternalism, it is the case that God and the entire timeline are co-eternal.
Right, right. Yeah, that's kind of the issue over there. And then it's like, okay, you made a point. What's the difference between being, like in the Christian view, what's the difference between being begotten and made? In that view, there really wouldn't be a difference.
Thing is, come up.
Like
Go on.
unintelligible.
Yeah. So what's funny is when I wrote that argument, no one has paid attention to it because a lot of people wanted to fight me on it, saying that's just not what eternal generation means because they didn't know basic church history. And now at this point, the conversation has changed and people are openly acknowledging that. So I should bring that argument up again. I've not brought it up in any debates since then.
Yeah, for sure. No, I when I read it, I was like, that's a valid argument because I thought about against, like, let's say the A-spatialities or Maturidis, for example. What's the difference between being created and uncreated in that view? If you're eternal, I don't understand that over there. As
They
well
say
as,
causally prior, but not temporally prior. But that's just a rendition of atemporal causality, which is just gibberish.
that's look at Wahd al-Wujud. Wahd al-Wujud, man, come up. But then
What I wanted to say, by the way, thing is when you're discussing like wrong block or like static block or like eternalism or whatever, is that typically when these people flesh these like temporal ontologies out, they're not making any exclusive claims. And when like a theistic rendition is like applied onto it, they're gonna make some like tweaked, modified rendition of this like temporal ontology. They're going to be like, oh, God is the mover of the growing block, or God is not included in this like eternal sort of like fuse set or whatever. All of that stuff, which I do believe is like not special pleading, but I believe it's just like the thing about like, again, not a solution, just introducing stuff.
Yeah, so this is what I really came to the conclusion in the aftermath of the end of the timeless God, was that a lot of philosophers of religion today, the way they approach things is they try to figure out a philosophical puzzle, and then when it comes to God, they're like, let's see if I can make this one little tiny issue like sort of compatible with God, and they're not doing any systematic work, and God's not really doing any meaningful work in their metaphysics. And so I'm like, put God to work in your ontology of the world. So it's not just like, oh yeah, like here's this crazy multiverse stuff, or here's this particular theory of time. I think I can tack God on there. I'm like, no. Really think through the implications here. Really develop the systematic connections. And so that's what you see in the Divine Time Maker book, is a much more robust attempt to really look at what are the implications for all of this in a much more rigorous way. Because I just don't think anybody was doing it. I think there was really terrible attempts at doing philosophy, systematic metaphysics.
Oh, thank you right here, right now. Thank you all. Anyways, look, I wanted to... Well, funny enough, something about atemporal causation, why do you have Wahdat al-Wujud? Bro, this guy's a troll. We're trying to keep this like academic. Don't do that. Like, thing is about atemporal causation, given like the possible world semantics, you're not going to make sense of it because like, if we have a deflated account of change, which is like two state of affairs not being numerically identical. Now, let's say some like token atemporally caused B in possible world 1. And let's say he's like an agent that is free. He can like refrain from acting. And possible world 2, that causal relation does not obtain. What explains that causal relation not obtaining? If not, that's just a change. So atemporal causation is not even a thing in possible world semantics.
So there's this new, 2 years old now, book by Christy Miller and Sam Barron. And I think it's just called Timelessness. And so it's based on some earlier papers where they're trying to figure out, say the entire world is timeless. They're not interested in God stuff. So they take God out of the equation, but they're just like, say the whole world is timeless. Could you have causation? And they think, well, we could give a purely counterfactual analysis of everything. And I think that's not causation, because for the exact point you brought up, is if I give a purely counterfactual analysis, you go, but why is there a difference here? And the differences should be like, well, because that A caused B, that's why. But if you give a counterfactual analysis, you're just like, well, if A wasn't there, then B wouldn't be there. And you're like, well, but why? And you're just denying a causation, I think.
But Dr. Ryan, do you know Hamid? He wanted to ask you a question. I'll ask his question on his behalf.
Okay.
Yeah. So Hamid asks, do you think the DDS conception of God can it be naturalizable?
Like, what do you mean?
Like, can a sort of like synthetic naturalist say, well, I can accept an absolute simple being, like, I don't know, causal relation there, grounds this, and whatever does all of this. But all I do is negate intentionality, and intentionality is already, like, tweaked up a bit with their conception of God. So what Hamid is trying to ask, would somebody like Malpass or whatever have an issue, or any synthetic naturalist, like something beyond that doesn't have a problem with realism, would they have an issue with like conceding first stage arguments by saying, but that object is naturalizable? That's not going to be like a supernatural or a natural object.
Oh gosh, because I mean the view that you're describing sounds like Plotinus. Like there's no intentionality in the one, but like the one.
Yeah,
just
definitely.
Like,
but I'm giving it
produces
sort
all
of
this
like more
stuff.
robust. Yeah, I agree. But I'm giving it sort of. I mean, that's something Hamid asked too. He said, "Can Plotinus's view can it be like reinterpreted in some hermeneutics that like deems this stuff to be like naturalizable?"
So, if you look at the discourse on naturalism over the last like 10 years or so, what gets counted as naturalism, I don't know what does not count as naturalism anymore when I look at some different writings.
Me too, yeah.
So like Mark Johnston, who's a very interesting provocative thinker at Princeton, he says he's a naturalist, and he's got God and this whole like panentheistic like story of the world, and I'm like, so God counts, and he's not the only naturalist who's like, yeah, I got God in my story, and I'm like, then what on earth are we talking about natural? What does naturalism even mean anymore? If we're allowing God and souls and all sorts of stuff, so I just don't know what naturalism really means anymore when I look at some of these guys.
Does he take God to be physical?
No. God's this sort of like non-physical thing that the universe is somehow constituted of. And I'm like, okay, I don't really know what the...
When I'm saying like physical, I'm specifically talking about if it is something which is a part of the language of physics, or is it something...
Objects that are studies of theoretical physics.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But before you go on, it was Hamid's Arc of Repentance on Twitter. That's what he wanted me to tell you.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So some of these people would say you could say God is an object of physics, but they get kind of anxious a little bit sometimes when you point that out. So remember Andrei Bukharev, he's a contemporary pantheist, and so he thinks that the universe is just like constituted of God, and just the universe just is God. And so I'm like, so when my wife is looking in the microscope in her lab, looking at molecular biology, she's studying God. And he's like, I mean, I wouldn't put it that way because there's the language of science and there's language of philosophy. And I was like, yeah, but I have to tell my wife she's studying God in the microscope, and she's going to laugh at that. She's not going to take you seriously. And he just kind of bit the bullet. He's like, yeah, no, it sounds weird.
Maybe a response you could have made to that is just saying that your wife would be looking at part of the universe, which is not the universe in entirety, and so that would not be God.
I mean, you're looking at part of God. Yeah, you're still looking at part of God. And I think a lot of biologists would find that hilarious because they're like, no, I'm looking at
linguistic differences. Like they're not interpreting like any of these specific items to be something which means some sort of divine being or anything, nor is it referring to any divine being, to be more specific. Yeah, of course, definitely.
Yeah, no, you're right. So like, there's a lot of like language you can use and try to say like, well, I'm talking about these specific domains and et cetera and so forth. But at the end of the day, you are going, I'm looking at God stuff. And I'm like, well, that's what I'm doing.
True. Like, I wanted to ask under that view, what is the quid est of the world? Divinity?
Like, yeah.
Is it like isomorphic to how an idealist would say the quid est of the world is consciousness?
Yeah, because that's like Andrei Bukharev's version of pantheism. It's not an idealism. It's this sort of like dual aspect monism kind of thing. But he really does think like it's just consciousness is like rock bottom reality. But consciousness, like in physical stuff, these are like two different ways of describing the same thing, though. And I'm just like, I don't know. Maybe I'm a dualist, so I just don't have the intuitions.
Oh, are you talking about like type B physicalism, or like you can speak of the mind and the brain differently, but like there's no ontological gap?
It's sort of in the neighborhood of that. Andre's got like a lot more nuance to it, to his view. I am not prepared to speak on all the nuance there.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's like open up.
What are you guys' notion of like parts in the context of divine simplicity?
Huh?
So this is something I bring up in the Divine Simplicity 5 Views book, because I have this complaint that no one will tell me, like, give me a good definition of what counts as a part. Because these people who affirm this absolute simplicity, they'll say everything under the sun counts as a part. And I'm like, well, what does not count as a part? And so I raised this twice in the debate book. And so when this comes out, every one of you will be able to read it. And you will see no one answers the question. I raise it twice, very forcefully, and no one even attempts to answer it. None of my debate partners attempt to answer it. So I take this as a complete failure of all of my debate partners.
So you don't believe that the word parts is going to be something which is semantically reducible or conceptually reducible, to be more specific here?
I just don't know, because I mean, I've studied mereology, and I just don't have a developed mereological account at all.
The thing is, my view on like what the part is, I think like the world itself, I'm kind of like a linguistic idealist to some extent. I believe that the propositions of causal power, and I think just parts are just reduced, they're just like basically propositions at a fundamental level.
I mean, I know there's views like that. I just don't know. So one intuition I have about parts is parts can come apart. So if you're looking at some object that's complex, but its features cannot come apart, then I'm like, well, we're not talking about parts then. Whereas
my hermeneutics, I do.
Yeah, that sounds like some sort of like physicalist notion or some sort of like physicalist idea. Not physicalist.
Yeah, the separability stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I don't
Ibn Taymiyyah's
hold that view,
position,
obviously.
though.
Yeah, the reason as to why I would not hold this view is because if you believe in, for example, the existence of angels or souls, for example, which are non-physical, right? You cannot say that like God exists and God is a simple being and these non-physical things are not simple if simplicity is determined based off its physicality or lack of physicality. That would be something which is incompatible with the theistic notion that we uphold.
Right. So yeah. So I was talking to Aaron Kotner at St. Andrews, and because he's one of the leading experts right now on mereology, and I was asking about this case of God because he was interested in the simplicity stuff, and he said he doesn't know what his intuitions are about mereology when we're talking about non-physical beings, because all the mereological discussions today are about physical things typically. So he was like, I just don't know what to say. And so I was like, well, what about like,
problem, right? For any like substance theorist who's like an absolute divine simplicity believer, they would have to give some sort of like, semantic distinction or some semantic qualifier for what a part is, and so forth. It would make it the case that these non-physical items are complex and God is simple, which most of them all of them I've come across are unable to do. I have I actually have like a sufficient qualifier, which goes back to the proposition stuff. I take it to be the case that like for any being which is absolutely divinely simple or divinely simple to be more specific, would be such a being that that being does not have any sort of like metaphysical dependence on some set of propositions. And my kind of like this dependency relation or causal relation is going to be that which is asymmetric. I think on the contrary, I think objects with parts are going to have some sort of like asymmetric causal dependency relation with some sort of propositions, which would be identical to the properties of said object, which I just take to be synonymous with parts.
That's my hermeneutic of parthood too. Not like in the same way you said it, but I do introduce like, if there's like if the priority is like ontological and ontological, then it's like there's a causal relation going on there. Then we can engage in parthood in a meaningful way.
I've got a question about this. So TK, so you said something is a part if it's metaphysically dependent or causally dependent on a proposition?
Something has parts if it is going to be dependent on propositions. Yeah, it's just to be the case that parts and propositions are identical. I think when we run a semantic reduction, it's going to end up boiling down to propositions. So here's at first it's unintuitive, but when I actually break it down, it's very intuitive. So usually if someone asks me, okay, what is a part? I'll just say a property of an object, that which is true of an object, which I just take it to be the case that those are identical. And so, if something is true of an object, it has to be a proposition because the only thing which possesses truth happeness is going to be proposition, right?
Yeah. Okay. So like, I've got this new like flip phone because that's cool again, and so it's got like two different parts because it flips, and those parts are dependent on a proposition.
To be the case that those parts are reduced with the proposition, so they
Reduced
might
with
not be.
proposition.
Yeah, so they're ontologically reduced with the propositions, even though they don't have the same sense that a proposition have, or the same sort of like secondary intention of a proposition. They are reduced with the propositions. I take it to be the case that, necessarily speaking, for any given part of an object, it would be identical to a proposition of that object, right? Because parts are properties of an object, and properties are things which are true of an object, and that which is true of something would have to be propositional.
Okay, I might be missing something, but it sounds like I would be holding a proposition in my hand right now instead of holding a phone in my hand.
I take it to be the case that physical things are not fundamental, right? So, I'm not even sure if I even accept it. I'm like an idealist.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of like,
okay.
for example, an idealist would say, for example, that like, yeah, they would grant that physical things exist, right? But they're just emergent from some sort of like source of consciousness. And so fundamentally, you're actually holding or seeing or observing consciousness. But at the same time, we're not going to ever say this in natural language or in normal conversations, because usually what we're talking about there are what we're looking at or investigating at face value, and not the fundamental aspect of what we're looking at or investigating at face value.
Okay. So yeah. Okay. So I don't buy idealism, but that makes more sense to me because at first I was like, I'm clearly not holding a proposition in my hand, but if you get this idealist scheme, I understand what you're saying now. Okay. That makes more sense to me now.
At the fundamental level, you kind of are, but I don't take. I even don't. So my view basically is like, so I have like I have like an interesting niche view of ontology. So I take it to be the case there are like three categories of ontology. Obviously, you have the abstractive, which are basically things without causal power. I'm agnostic on whether these things exist, but maybe they do exist. You have physical things, right? Like the things we're observing with spatio-temporal extensionality. And you have this neutral substance, which I just take to be something which is reflective of the category of propositions. So propositions are neither the abstractive, because propositions, under my view of what causation is, would have causal power, nor would they be something which is physical, because I take it to be the case that physical things are emergent from these propositions and the causal efficacy they have, instead of being wholly identical to these propositions.
Well, that's interesting.
Under my view, you can have like my connection is kind of bad, but under my view, you're going to have like a very interesting, or rather going to have a fleshed out view of what parts actually is, while at the same time being able to sufficiently distinguish between God, who is simple, and other non-physical beings that you would not believe to be simple, given some sense of like, dependence or relation complexity, mereological complexity, to be more specific.
No, I'll need to think more about that because I'm working on this book right now on models of God and different problems of creation. And one of the chapters I have is on idealism, like would God create an idealist universe? And so it's extending this debate that I had with Sam Liebens over what he calls Hasidic idealism, because he's looking at some different variants you find in the Jewish tradition. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that the view I hold is not something which is like I've like not seen it in the literature. I don't even read philosophy anymore. It's just a matter of like I just take it to be the case that like usually if you just introspect on a lot of these views, they're just like either false or just gibberish. And so yeah, I would say like okay, it depends on like how you define idealism, Yusuf. Depends.
Linguistic idealist early on.
Yeah, he's not like Wahdat al-Wujud, guys. That's cooked. That's like super cooked. But I remember you mentioned a point.
Yeah, because idealism can be equivocated. There are some atheists that say every theist is an idealist. Because there's this like really short argument, originates from Berkeley. If God can perceive everything and there's nothing that can exist accept that it's only perceived by God, then we're all mind dependent. If we're all mind dependent, then idealism is true.
That's
It
what
sounds
sacred
like
runs. That's the
yeah,
literally the same
That's
thing.
not a
Yeah.
question to be an idealist, because it
just
can be a dualist and
I want
believe
to
that
make
we're
this point for the chat
dependent on
because
God.
you have to realize that some people, because of that standard called theist idealist, which obviously is very contentious, so you have to know the hermeneutic of idealism before like engaging
Yeah.
with the interlocutor.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Idealism, in the sense that
I just take it to be the
believes
case
in
that what
profile.
distinguishes idealism from like theism is just that obviously you can be a theist and believe that all things are causally or metaphysically dependent on God existing, and not believe it to be the case that idealism is true because you believe that there are two fundamental substances in the universe or in existence, and that there's physical things and non-physical things, which you take it to be the case that God would be qualified under. And by fundamental, usually under this view, they're specifically talking about, or rather, they're denying any sort of reduction. So they're not going to say that the physical things in the universe are reducible, whether whether ontologically or epistemologically, to God. They're not reducible to God, but they're dependent on God. And one has to understand the distinction between reductionism and causation, insofar as reductionism is usually explaining something in virtue of the facts of something else. There are things which are dependent on something else, and it's not the case that it is reducible to that said thing. That's a confusion which generally happens in philosophical conversations. So yeah, they're not the same thing, clearly, right?
Well, anyone who sees idealism, they think of Wahdat al-Wujud now, especially on TikTok.
Yeah, but, bro, that guy's a troll. Don't even bring him up. Like, don't
He
even bring it
genuinely
up.
believes that stuff. I don't think he. I
Yeah, I know, but don't
think he's a
even bring it
troll,
up
but,
as like, don't even like mention his name. Like, he's too
what's
true.
it called? Ryan, you mentioned something in your paper, in your book, about. See, typically atemporalists, people who hold to divine simplicity, all of this, they're fine with Cambridge change, but you mentioned that there's people who actually would say that that's like a real change. So I don't know if you could touch upon that a little bit.
Yes. So this was a controversial point, which should not have been remotely controversial, because I give all the textual evidence for it. So this idea of Cambridge change, this is a term that came up in the 20th century by Peter Geach. And the idea is it's just a relational change. So when I worked at Cambridge Divinity Department, I lived south of Cambridge Divinity Faculty Building, and then I'd walk to work, and then I'd enter through the building, and I was north of the building. The building didn't intrinsically change, but it changed relationally to me. And so this is what's called a Cambridge change. And a bunch of contemporary classical theists were like, oh yeah, God can change in terms of relationships, that's fine. Whereas when I was looking at all the medieval Christians, except for Anselm, everyone was like, no, God can't change relationally. Like that would be, he'd have a before and after. And so Augustine is really bothered by this problem. And I trace it out through Augustine and through like Boethius, Peter Lombard, like all these people, where they're like, yeah, God is not really related to the universe. Why? Because if God were related to the universe, he would have these relational properties. He would undergo relational changes and would not be timeless or immutable. And so I'm like, okay, fine. So I was just like, this is just a basic point. And every time I get pushback on it, I'm like, well, what about, this 10 pages of historical exegesis I give? And they're like, well, they just didn't mean that. I'm like, they didn't mean those things that they said? Cool, great. We're just lying about the past now.
The insane thing, though, is, and this is an argument that people should put forth more, is the point that you made about if he's not, right now in the present sustaining the universe, that it's more so, you mentioned about the mixed relation. So it'd be like a conceptual relation, if I'm not mistaken. And the point that the atheist could simply say the same thing, that, God is conceptually sustaining a universe or something along those lines. So what's the difference between that and an atheist at that point? I think that was something good that people should really point out more, because if God's really not related to the universe in that sense, that he's not sustaining it, why can't the atheist just say the same?
Yes. So this is something I point out even more forcefully in this more recent paper called The Creator-Creature Distinction and Debates Over Rival Models of God, and then in my Divine Time Maker book, because you shouldn't have the theist and the atheist agreeing on like, yeah, God's not not the efficient cause of the universe. God's not like causally related. God doesn't know what the universe exists, and like, right? These are not points that a theist and atheist should agree on. That just seems obvious to me. And if you have to say God's not related to the universe in order to defend your view, I think you've already lost the plot at that point. I mean,
Which view are you talking about?
so the view of like people like Augustine and Aquinas and others, that God's not related to the universe in order to avoid God changing.
So I kind of hold. I'm not sure if I hold to the same view.
Your mic is bugging out.
Bugging, by the way.
Yeah.
No.
Hello.
Lagging or something.
By the way, Dr. Ryan, it's Arc of Repentance.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So I was
hold
saying
on.
like
TK, just one moment. Arc of Repentance wanted to ask you about the PSR. General commitments or general concerns?
What I'm trying to figure out right now at the moment is which version of the PSR I want to affirm, because there's a bunch of different ways you could articulate it, and they have different interesting entailments. So I think some version of the PSR has to be true, because you don't have things existing without any explanation at all. I think that's just nuts.
You want my
but which
outlook on
version of
that?
it, I don't know.
I believe. Wait, am I audible?
Yeah.
I don't accept any PSR. I believe so long as like you have things like abduction, like I don't even know why I should make like universal probability, universal claims, like every proposition is ought to be explained like this or whatever. And I do, well, nowadays it's called the strong PSR. I do believe that's incompatible with theism.
some kind of explanation being employed when you say that you don't believe that like every proposition ought to be explained.
Sorry?
PSR is like saying that something is necessarily true, or they're just like relaying like some fact about the world.
I mean, it depends on the PSR. There's like the epistemic one, and then there's like the ontological one. And
Because the epistemic one, if you're like an infinitist, it's just going to be true, right?
Yeah, I know.
Infinitist is
But
true, then
the
that's
one I'm
true.
referring to is like the one Leibniz and whatever the strong PSR.
At the
proposes.
causal account of explanation.
Yeah. So what I have in mind with the PSR when I say the strong one is incompatible with theism is because if there are no brute facts and I take aseity to not mean bruteness, but to entail bruteness, because to say something is metaphysically brute is to say like it lacks any external ground. It's inexplicable. And I remember when I ran this on people, they said, oh no, but God is self-explained. That's only consistent under things like, as I said, existential predicativist ontologies. Those are incoherent. And that's my problem with the PSR. And remember what I told you about Jonathan Schaffer saying grounding relations always are going to implicate or yield infinite regression, only and only until like inexplicability is introduced. That is exactly the same type of argument. And that's why I believe like such simple doctrines like aseity are going to entail brute facts. And to retain that,
The cause and effect individually separate.
hold on, let me just finish this point.
It entails some incompatibility. If you're going to
I
say
know,
that
but
something
hold on. Let me just finish this point. And to retain the truthfulness of aseity, you have to like affirm a brute fact, and that's the issue. What do you think?
On some accounts of bruteness is supposed to be this inexplicable thing, and then on some accounts of like is something ungrounded or whatnot, they'll say it means it doesn't have an external explanation, so therefore it's brute. But not everybody will buy that. Like there are various people, like Tim O'Connor. He'll say, well, no, like the explanation is like when you just reflect on the thing itself, like it's intrinsic to it, and so there's no bruteness there. So it's like this necessary being. And when you reflect on the essence of it, you're like, well, yeah, it has to be that way. It just couldn't be any other way. So there's nothing brute. And the criteria for bruteness being that if it has no external explanation, he's just going to say that doesn't apply because rationality just demands you have to get to like some necessary being or necessary thing. And so that would be weird if rationality just entails you get to bruteness. So he would just reject the
metaphysically brute necessity at that point. It's just saying
So,
there's
yeah,
like this necessary entity, but it's like still brute because there's no external ground. It's just inexplicable, and that's what bruteness is.
Yeah, so O'Connor is going to deny this account of bruteness and and these conditions for bruteness, and they'll say it is explicable because you could look at the essence of the thing and you're like, yeah, it just has to exist. But not everybody's satisfied with that. So Chad McIntosh has this really nice paper on the PSR and aseity, where he looks at like Aquinas and Leibniz and all these others to try to go, what are you guys really saying when you claim that God's essence just explains itself? Okay, and so he says like it's about as clear as mud. So he's trying to come up with a better account of aseity.
Exactly,
he has
and that's what I said.
like
the contention, the pushback to that premise would be, no, aseity does not introduce brute facts, but it's like self-explanation. But thing is, like, it's still explained, but it just explains itself. But I said, like, that's only viable under existential predicative ontologies, which I believe are incoherent. Well, I want to introduce my good friend here, Venus. What's up?
Yo, what's going on? I'm just listening.
What's up? You want to ask Ryan Mullins any questions?
I'm just listening in now.
What came up for the vibes? By the way, Umar, is this the first time you hear Venus?
Yeah, it's the first time, man. What's up, dude?
Yeah, what's going on? Thanks for letting me up.
Venus is a cultural Muslim.
Jadar would ask for you to explain what you mean every single term.
No, he's just mocking tag.
Yeah.
What do you mean by mean?
It does get down to that.
Ryan Mullins.
Mm-hmm.
Remember when you were basically talking about like how you wouldn't understand like or how you wouldn't understand like how I wouldn't like to claim that you said you wouldn't understand it, but rather it's kind of like really interesting or niche for someone to basically say that like, you know, the things you're looking at are just propositions. How would you distinguish substances and properties given your perspective? I usually don't believe that there's any like proper semantic distinction, which would make it the case that these two concepts are exclusive conditions.
Like a distinction between substances and properties?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'd just kind of go with the standard like textbook examples, or like properties are things that inhere in a substance. Like a substance is a property bearer. Like
okay, so give me an example of a substance under your perspective, like in the sense of account of what the substance is.
Like a mind would be an example of a substance. Would you say
a mind adhere in the universe or no? And if so, why?
Inhere in the universe? Like I don't think the universe is a substance.
Okay, so
I think the universe is a collection of substances.
Okay, so what about space-time? Do you think that's a substance or no? Do you think those are just relations?
I don't affirm the relational view. So I affirm something a bit weirder. So I think space and time, absolute space and time, are divine attributes.
Okay, so you don't think the mind adheres in anything, just to be clear on this.
Right. Yeah. So I think things like a mind would be an example of a substance. So it's a property bearer. So properties inhere in a mind.
What are the necessary conditions what are the necessary and the sufficient conditions for something to not adhere in something else?
I have no idea. I don't know.
See, that's the problem, right? So like usually like when you like break down the concept, like there usually isn't any sort of like conditions, which makes it the case that substances and properties are unequivocally distinct from one another, right?
I guess. I mean, this is a common problem in philosophy, is trying to think if you can identify the necessary and sufficient conditions to distinguish different things. So, like one example is like the abstract to concrete distinction. Most philosophers go, yeah, there's a distinction there. The best way to capture it is up for grabs. And then the property substance, I would feel is in kind of the same camp of like, it's hard to figure out what the necessary and sufficient conditions are, but there's still this intuition that there's a distinction there.
Well, the intuition is more like an epistemic tool that you use to navigate whether something is true or not true. But it's not the type of tool which I think is effective insofar as discerning or distinguishing two different concepts. I think that's more of like so there's a distinction between introspection on the concept of something or the defining properties of a concept, and using your intuitions to discover what is true and what is not true, which I take to be a bit different from those conceptual type talks, you know?
Yeah, sorry, I was getting a phone call, so I think everything cut out, so I didn't hear what you guys were saying.
Well, your mic kind
can you hear me?
of bugged out for a second, but yeah, it's good enough.
Okay, so
yeah,
I was saying basically that I take it to be the case that intuitions is not something which would distinguish two concepts, right? It's more like the thing which you use to discover facts about the world. And in this
Correct.
case specifically, it's not really a matter of like you're looking at facts about the world, but you're looking at how you're employing a given word in a given conversation, and that's what requires something called a conceptual introspection, right? And I don't think that's something which is some truth navigation about the world itself, right? So I don't think it is appropriate to use intuitions in this type of context. Not saying it is completely inapplicable, but it's not something which qualifies as a semantic distinction or conceptual distinction, but rather I have this feeling that this is conceptually or semantically distinct from one another.
Yeah, I mean that's exactly how intuitions work. Is like it's supposed to kind of like help me figure out like I feel like there's a distinction here, and then you try to make the distinction.
But again, like
yeah, so
how that would
intuitions
not
are
be
distinctions.
linguistically effective, right? Like the reason that would not be linguistically effective is because, for example, if someone asked me, okay, so what's your account of causation? And I see something like, I have an account of causation, or I have a definition of a cause, and I give like a really vague definition, and I say, I just have the intuition that anything which qualifies under this concept would be a cause, right? So like, you can use this intuitionistic approach towards like literally any sort of semantical analysis type questions, and you'd be in the case scenario where you're never really able to actually break down the concept, right? Because every single time when someone asks for the definition of a word, you appeal to your intuitions that some given object would qualify as this given thing. Like, for example, if someone asks, what's your definition of God? And I'm like, I don't really have a definition or any established conditions, but I have the intuition that the universe would be God or would qualify as God given my definition, right? It's not really giving you some sort of like information about your semantical content.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah, I mean, intuitions are they're not semantic content. They're not claims. It's just like, like I've got this intuition that this is wrong, and you're like, why? So all it does is just prompts you to start trying to figure out the why. Yeah, that seems right to me.
Right. So I wanted to ask, what's up?
Is my connection?
It's fine.
No, is my connection good? Is it?
Yeah, it's fine.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, did you want to ask something? I want to get into like Necessitarianism, but if you
Go
wanna
on,
ask
go on, go
something,
on. Because I'm asking like an audience question. It's like unimportant. Go on.
No, I was just curious because there are some like amongst them like the Muslims, like the Sadrians and Aquarians and Ismailis who just like bite the bullet on the Necessitarianism that follows from like the model of the divine simplicity. So I was just like curious what kind of arguments would you run against Necessitarianism? Or is it just like an intuition? Or is it just like an intuition, model intuition thing for you?
So there's a few different arguments you can run. One, you could do modal intuition. Another one I run is related to theodicy, and then a third one is related to like freedom, and then a fourth one is related to morality. So which one would you like to hear?
Oh, could you like go through all of them, or would that too?
Yeah, no, that's fine. So so think about the electron that's next to your left elbow. Most of you probably weren't thinking about the electron that's next to your left elbow until right now, but could it be just slightly closer to your left elbow than it is at the moment? And if Necessitarianism is true, the answer is no. Like it couldn't be slightly closer to your elbow or slightly farther away. It could only be that one location where it is, and that's it. And I find that very counterintuitive because it seems to me like, that could just be slightly to the left a bit or slightly to the right. So that's like the kind of modal intuitions people run. They'll give a bunch of these different cases where it's like, it just seems things could have been different. That's that. When it comes to freedom, I mean, this is a very standard argument against necessitarian views. Is like, well, nobody has free will. And you could just be like, but like freedom's like compatible with determinism. And I'm like, we're not even talking about determinism. We're talking about fatalism, like outright fatalism. No one has any choices. Everything that you do is exactly the only thing you could possibly do because it's the only way the world could be. Neither God nor creatures have any free will on this view. This is not determinism. This is fatalism, and so it's kind of bad if nobody, not even God, has free will. You're like, whew. Now here's where you get into theodicy. So a lot of different views on theodicy want to say, here's this really horrible thing over there. did that have to be there, or did God have a justifying reason to permit it? And then we give these different kind of arguments for why God might have a justifying reason to permit it. Now, when we say permit, what we're saying is God could have done something different, but he had reason to not do that. He had reason to allow it. And so there's this idea that God could do one thing or another. He could allow it or he could intervene. If you have a modal collapse, God cannot allow and God cannot intervene, because whatever God's doing is the only thing that he could do. And whatever is happening is the only thing that could ever happen. So this entire idea, this entire way of talking about allowing, permitting, is just out the window. And this brings me to the final one, which is morality. So ought implies can. I say you ought to do this, you ought to do that. It implies that you've got the ability to do whatever it is I think you ought to do. Don't tell a lie. That lie you told earlier, you should not have done that. Don't do that. Well, on a modal collapse, you can't do otherwise than what you do. So all the different commands, the obligations, everything, all that goes out the window, because you can't do anything other than what you find yourself doing, because it's the only way the world is. So our entire moral discourse, deontological discourse at least, just goes out the window. These are the kind of arguments you can run.
Oh, I see.
The problem with what you're saying, in my opinion, I think like the model intuitions you have, it is dependent on like some sort of equivocation. So you can grant that it is the case, like necessitarianism is true. That means the world could have not been otherwise. But the word "could" there is referring to some different type of modality or modal scope. In contrast with like what people generally mean when they're saying the election beside my left elbow, for example, could have been closer. I think generally speaking, when people make these possibility claims, they reference an epistemic possibility, which is not the same as the type of possibility referenced in the context of metaphysics. And I think even in the case of morality, I think when people are talking about ought implies can, I don't think they're specifically talking about the type of niche modality which is used in metaphysics that hard determinists / necessitarians actually employ in theistic conversations. So the modal intuitions you have is not really attacking the hard determinist / necessitarian perspective or view. It's morely dependent on like a different modal system, which is basically you essentially talking past these philosophers.
Yeah, there's a sense in which you could try to run these sort of arguments. I was just giving you like a first blush at like this is the way these arguments sort of go. Yeah, if you want to like try to defend like a whole necessitarian view, you do have to come up with the whole semantics of what people mean when they're talking about contingency and this or that. A lot of different philosophers who work on modal metaphysics will often look at the necessitarian going, "You're putting words into my mouth. That's definitely not what I mean when I said the electron could be a little bit closer to my elbow. I wasn't speaking in this particular necessitarian like way." So you get these kind of issues that pop up of going, I see what you want to do with the semantics, but that's just not capturing what people are saying.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I think that's like, I agree with you. I think generally speaking, when people make like possibility claims about the world, like I could have went to work, but I didn't go to work, they're basically saying like, given what I know, right, there's nothing about the universe, given my knowledge, which impedes me from going to work, whether causally, in the less rigorous sense. I think it's what people generally mean when they're talking about, like, for example, something being able to happen. They're talking about given the facts I have, or given certain axioms or grounds by epistemology. Not saying the average layman is actually those specific jargon, but just to clarify what they're trying to implicate or insinuate in those contexts. They're saying, given what I know about the world, this could have happened, right? And I think that sort of knowledge is far less rigorous than the sort of knowledge that's been employed in metaphysical conversations, whereas it is grounded by something a lot more rigorous, a lot more, you could say, nuanced than just a mere empirical knowledge or some sort of like, knowledge which is grounded by even testimonies, one could say, right?
Yeah.
Modal equivocation, really. It's just talking past each other, just to summarize.
Yeah, that happens a lot in philosophy. I remember when I was trying to chat with Peter Van den Wagen about some of my research, and he ran some idea by me, and I was like, I don't find that remotely plausible. And he's like, I'm not trying to persuade you of anything. We're doing philosophy. And I'm like, oh, I kind of thought that's what we were doing when we were doing philosophy, but that's not the way Peter sees philosophy.
I'm not sure if you were actually trying to use this as some sort of like argument or reason against necessitarianism, like you're appealing to your modal intuition, but one could always just question the nature of the intuitions. Like, okay, are these intuitions about the scope, the relevant scope that metaphysical necessitarians are actually employing in conversations, or is it about something completely different? And if so, if it is about something completely different, then there's no means or reason as to why we should even care about those modal intuitions, right? The only reason it would be relevant is if the modal scope that necessitarians employ in theistic conversations is also the same modal scope that's employed by those same necessitarians in moralistic conversations.
Maybe. Typically when I see a lot of these sort of debates, they don't even want to get into semantics because they think it's a red herring, because they go, no, I know there's actual real contingency in the world. I'm not interested in. Yeah, and so, but like this is why like Brian Leftow, when he's doing the modal collapse argument, he's just like, no, everything in our modal intuition screams against this necessitarian view. And you see the same kind of reaction in like early modern philosophy against Spinoza and against Leibniz of going, no, you gave us this sort of story of the world and there's no contingency. And Leibniz is like, well, I've got this way of talking, and everyone's like, we don't care. There's no contingency. So I think a lot of times they just don't care about the semantics of like what the necessitarian's really trying to say. They're like, no, just stop it. Like they want to cut the conversation off before that.
The main important tenets of philosophical conversations, right, which is semantical clarity, right? One could say it's an ignorant way of approaching these conversations, which I know it is. But with that being said, at the same time, if you're making a particular presupposition, right, which is, it hinges on a specific semantic intuition or a belief that the same semantics you're employing is the same semantics the person you're interfacing with or talking to is employing. But then when the person is really trying to confirm this presupposition, you're like, you know what? I'm not going to talk about my presupposition, and I don't think it is relevant. I think that's really ridiculous. I think it's akin to like questioning someone on the presupposition of some claims they're making, and they're refusing to actually talk about it. That's just basically my perspective on the matter.
Yeah.
Professor Mullins, out of the four arguments you gave, which one do you find like most convincing personally?
The modal intuition, I think that's the strongest. But the theodicy and the moral ones, those have really bothered me a lot more recently. Because when I'm doing like Christian theology, I mean, these are all standard distinctions people want to make in moral philosophy and in theodicies, and all of that has to go out the window if you've got this fully necessitarian view. And I'm like, whew, that's a pretty like really steep price to pay. Whereas like Kate Rogers, she just goes, there's no big deal. And so what I run these four arguments against her in this forthcoming Divine Simplicity debate book, and her response is still to just shrug her shoulders and be like, And I'm like, is not an answer. Like, this is pretty wild. But but Kate's willing to bite the bullet on a lot of stuff that most people are not. So I expected that from her.
I have like a follow up, and then I think somebody wants to ask in the audience a question. Maybe they should get a chance. But so like I know there are like some people who don't hold to like intuitions or intellectual being like justifiers. So I'm just curious, like what kind of epistemology do you hold to in which like modal intuitions can have the function of like non-inferential justification? And my second question was regarding both the moral argument and the free will argument. You don't think somebody could salvage that, and like kind of like what TKA was going into, salvage that by appealing to epistemic modality while granting necessitarianism under like a more metaphysical modality? But those are my nice questions.
Yeah, so I don't have a worked out epistemology anymore. Like back in the day, like I used to really be interested in epistemology, and I was all obsessed with like a proper functionalism and everything, and phenomenal conservatism and all this jazz. I just haven't studied epistemology in any meaningful depth in a very long time. So I've got no worked out epistemic view anymore. So when it comes to, if people were to say, well, we're just talking about epistemic modality and not like the metaphysical modality, I want to say, no, we're talking about the metaphysical modality, because that's what really at the end of the day matters. So Kate Rogers, again back to her because this is someone I've debated a few times. So she'll try to make this kind of move, and it's similar to what Leibniz does as well, to go, well, it's epistemically possible. You could conceive of other ways the world could be. And I'm like, okay, fine. From my perspective, I could do that. What about from God's perspective? And here's exactly what Kate says. She's like, well, God's perspective, which is the best perspective, and the only perspective that matters, says this is the only way the world could be. So sure, from my perspective, I could do these things, but it's not. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant.
Yeah, so I was like wondering. I mean, I asked you the question, so that's like a fair point. But like, what if somebody's like an atheist, for example, and they're looking like for an argument against Necessitarianism? Would I imagine that move obviously wouldn't work.
Oh well, then there's this one woman, I forget what her name is. She has a book that came out just a few years ago, arguing for Necessitarianism, and as far as I know, she's an atheist. So she's just willing to be like, yeah, that's fine.
She was on Joe Schmidt's channel. I forgot her name.
Yeah,
I know
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you do find some people like that, which was interesting because previously, like early 2000s, you would have people, these different atheists, trying to avoid different cosmological arguments for the existence of God by doing a different kind of modal collapse, where they'd say everything's contingent, there's no necessities at all, and you're like, isn't it necessary that there's no necessities? Like, and they're like, well, if you're gonna play that game, I'm like, you mean basic modal logic game? Like, so yeah, it's kind of swung back around to this other sort of view, which that's fine. That happens in history. But yeah, there's people who have no interest in God but are wanting to go, why not Necessitarianism?
I see. You said you didn't have a worked out epistemology. Would you say you lean internalist or externalist now?
I used to think I understood the difference between these two views. And then when I was at an epistemology conference a few years ago, I felt like I lost my grasp because the conversations had changed so much, where they're just like, yeah, I mean, you still like need evidence. You still need to know kind of the internal connections for like some of your beliefs to the justification, but not all of them. I'm like, so is there a difference between internalism and externalism? Like, yeah, maybe. And so I don't know anymore. I just don't know. It's out of my depths. It's not my field.
Oh, I see. Thanks.
Oh, by the way, I wanted to. This was the audience question, but I don't know. We got like it derailed a lot. I just remembered it now. Somebody asked, do you affirm or negate a deterministic link for God's like will to act? And if so, why wouldn't providential collapse apply to you?
Oh, this whole idea of like saying there's this indeterministic link between God's like will and his action, I find this so absurd. I really do. Like, I don't understand how you could have omnipotence anymore. So here's what you get. So it's like God's like, okay, here's all the worlds I could possibly create. I want world number 23. I don't want world 1002. I don't want world 1 million and whatever. I want number 23. So God snaps his fingers, and then all of a sudden, like world 2,000,078 comes into existence. He's like, oh crap, that's not the world I wanted. Let's try that again. And he tries it again, and he gets like world like 3 million something or other. He's like, oh, okay, pale, what am I going to do here? And he just keeps going on like this until, hopefully he eventually gets world number 23. That's what an indeterminist link is. And I'm like, that's an absurd view of God. It's not omnipotence in any sort of meaningful sense. And if that's what you have to say in order to defend divine simplicity, go for it. Just say all sorts of implausible things. I just think it makes the view look more ridiculous. So this whole idea of indeterministic gap, it's deeply ad hoc, and it gives you this just a negation of omnipotence.
Well, I don't have a problem with indeterministic links by some other way. I've actually grown to be sympathetic towards them, but I do have a problem if you say God is identical to his will and his will is brute. Then that's like extreme.
Yeah, that's another extreme. Yeah.
But I'm agnostic with respect to God's. I don't have a position now. I used to believe like God just contingently explains all of his actions, but there's this sort of like problem brought up with like this infinite regression, and I remember Proust commenting on it too, and that's why Proust says like contrastive explanations are brute, where like God contingently explains everything, but like let's take all those contingent explanations like in a set. What contingently explains? Is that contingently explained? Then like it keeps going back until you affirm like something necessary that explains all of them. Then it gets into the discussion, okay, if you take them to like, if you take explanations as like standardly well-formed, that will be entailing, and we don't want to say that. So they're going to do this sort of like non-entailing explanation and add metaphysics into it. It's going to be like a whole lot of can of worms. That's why I'm all agnostic on that like sort of discourse.
Yeah. Okay. So Tim O'Connor's book,
that's
Theism.
That's Van Inwagen's argument, by the way. Or I guess
right. Yeah. So if you take the PSR to involve like contrastive explanations, then you're going to have these kind of problems. Tim O'Connor says there's no reason we should take the PSR to involve contrastive explanations, because why you did one thing was because you had reason to do it. Well, why not the other thing? Because you did A and not instead of B. You know, like you had reasons to do it. That's the explanation. You had reasons to do it. And so when it comes to the contingency within God's will, like O'Connor says, well, there's an explanation for that. God necessarily has free will, and that just entails that God could do A or not A. So everything's explained. And why does God create this world instead of another one? He's like, well, because he had reason to do this. So he's got a much more like nuanced PSR that I can't remember all the details.
And then again, it's going to be the kind of worms. Why? What is the reason as to why God did this, and so on and so forth? And yeah, I think you get the whole picture, and you get why I sort of refrain from that discourse.
Yeah. So for the longest time, I thought O'Connor's account was quite good because he's like, because here's this distinction that people make in a lot of the reasons literature now. They'll say things like there's a justifying reason, and then there's what are called decisive or coercive reasons. Decisive reasons are like where like rationality just demands you have to do that action. Whereas a justifying reason is you would be rational to perform that action because you've got reason to do it. But you wouldn't be like crazy or irrational if you didn't do it. And so what I think O'Connor was after was to trying to say like, yeah, God has justifying reasons to create this universe, but they're not decisive reasons. So it's no big deal. Whereas like what Proust and some of these others, like they seem to only think in terms of like decisive reasons.
Yeah.
Decisive reasons from justifying reasons.
Oh, you want me to do the distinction again? Yeah. So a justifying reason is you've got a reason to do some action, but it would not be irrational for you to refrain from doing it. So like it's some good reasons, but rationality doesn't demand you have to do it. Whereas a decisive reason, or what's sometimes called a coercive reason, is rationality demands you have to do it. You would be irrational if you did not perform that action.
How would you break down the term irrational? Like what does that mean? Like just to not be rational, right?
So you're rational if and only if you are appropriately responsive to reasons. So if you're irrational, you'd be inappropriately responding to reasons. You would either be ignoring them, or you'd be paying attention to them but acting against them.
With reasons, right?
Do I say that
Either
again?
your actions or your motivations are not being conformity with the reasons established or which exist.
Correct. Yeah.
And so, what would be your reasons in this context?
So like with like regards to like why God would create, like O'Connor, like actually there's a massive debate here. So it could be like the value of the universe, and there's like this overall value. So you could have like aggregate value. So it might be a bunch of aesthetic and a bunch of moral values and things like this. And then there's also these kind of like relational, or what's sometimes called organic unity, and organic value of the relationships between the different things in the universe. And so there's all these debates about the best way to articulate it, and I cannot figure out the best way to articulate it.
Would there be like desires of an object or a given thing, or something else?
Your desires are tracking values. So your desire something that is valuable.
So the desires tracks the values, but they aren't identical to the values. So what to do with values?
Correct. So yeah, so the values are just there. Like these, like certain things just are intrinsically valuable.
No, I'm asking like, what does the word value mean in the context of like axiology in your perspective?
Oh, I just think I guess I find something like the good or value to be like not like it's primitive. It's not further analyzable. So like they sort of like the openness argument that you see from like Moore or someone like that.
I just take values to be the sort of mental properties which are identical to desires. In the context of like aesthetic values, for example, or generally speaking, when they say that a given object is valuable, like for example, money is valuable, is something which is generally desirable. In the context of moral values, I take values to mean something which is identical to the relevant properties, which guides us to the relevant action-guided facts, the relevant normative facts. So I'm actually an externalist about values insofar as I believe those values in the context of moralistic conversations are objective. But I'm not sure how this would be something which, distinguishes justified reasons from decisive reasons in this context, because...
Don't do that. No. Keep academics. Relax, bro.
I don't know what.
We don't need... That was like...
All right, man. We just gotta see the guy yapping in the comments, dude. That's all, man.
Okay, like Dr. Ryan, you're gonna like this. Basically, there's this like Abyssinian LARP or whatever. He gets pretty like emotional about this stuff.
Okay.
And he said your explanation was horrible. Like, oh, and I was like, why is it horrible? And I just mentioned the fact where we had a 10-minute discussion, and he said if you upload that anywhere, I'm gonna sue you because I never consented. And then I mentioned that and he got triggered. But Apollo, didn't Nassar get mad at you too?
Nasser?
Yeah.
Yeah, he was like talking trash apparently, and then like he was like apparently like in the recent chat, in some chat, he was like, "Hey, what's up, Apollo?" I'm like, "What's up?" But weren't you talking shit though? Let's debate. And he didn't even respond afterward.
Go back to Professor Mullins, though. This isn't.
Okay, look, we're trolling. We're trolling now. Let's keep academic.
I can do like two more questions because it's midnight here in Scotland.
Oh right, I forgot. I keep thinking you're in America. That's the problem.
I've been running around. I was in Switzerland last week, and then I was in Finland the week before that, and then I'm going back to Finland again in a couple of weeks.
Damn, so it's like nighttime for you this entire time. I thought.
Yeah.
And in the back of my head, I was like, well, I'm in the Western time zone. I thought like. It was like afternoon for you too, but damn.
No. I mean, a lot of times I'm in the East Coast, but I've been in Europe over the last few months.
What are some? Well, I guess until like audience, what are like some upcoming things that like you're writing on, or like you're working on?
Yeah, I've got a bunch of different things at the moment. So the one that's coming to an end is this. Incarnation for Views book that I'm editing. That it's almost done. Like we just have to do like copy editing stuff, and it's all boring stuff. And that'll hopefully be out by the fall. There's a big book I'm working on called Models of God and the Problems of Creation, where I'm trying to look at all the different models of God and figure out why would God create anything at all? What kind of universe would God create? This kind of stuff. There's a popular level book I'm doing called Letters from a Reluctant Theologian, which is just these short little essays on a lot of different topics. And I've got a bunch of friends contributing theirs. I got Ramon Harvey doing an Islamic perspective. I've got Tyler McNabb, who's co-authored some stuff with Jamie Turner, writing an essay like "Why Am I Catholic?" Just like all over the place. There's one that I'm hoping we can get going. Mohammed Saleh Zapor and we wanted to do a debate on what is God like. And so we're both kind of slowly working on our opening statements for the debate book. It's just a matter of like, does Saleh have the time to really fully dedicate to it or not at the moment? But that's the one I thought was like, I'm really looking forward to if we can get that going.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has any other questions.
For the whole, well, there was somebody who asked in the audience something about the incarnation earlier. I think you should do that as the last question.
Yeah, I saw a question earlier. Was that the one in regards to it being logical?
Well, that's broad. I think we can make it more interesting. Let me ask this. Dr. Ryan, well, I want to push back on this, but you said you don't have time. But what view of the Trinity, I presume you're a social Trinitarian, but given that, do you believe that's compatible with like classical semantics of like how we count and so on, or do you take Branson's approach of like, oh, they're only individuated if and only if they're like separated by matter or like space, like spatio-temporal conditions?
The Four Views book on the Trinity, it's in the Doctrine of God series that I'm the editor of, and I don't know if I really understand Branson's view. I'm going to release an interview with him on my podcast, like I think next month. And I even after like reading through the whole thing and reading his other papers and then interviewing him and having lunch with him several times, I still don't know if I know what his view is. I really don't. So I can't understand it. I'm really sorry. I just can't. So that's a disappointing one. So yeah, I could do one more question that maybe we'll hopefully have a more interesting answer.
Right. I can tell you're enjoying this, yo. Let me think. I don't know. We pretty much, I don't know. I exhausted all my questions at the beginning. And that was one of the, I don't know. I consider this live entirely nice. Well, except for the trolling parts, but but that's the bad thing about TikTok. There's a lot of trolls.
Yeah. I mean, if there is one, I could do like last question.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I want to go back to epistemology, even though you said that's not like your forte. But you said like you couldn't like distinguish between internal. Like you ended up saying that there's like no. You have a hard time seeing the difference.
Well, so let me clarify before I ask your question because it might change it. So the earlier distinctions people made between internalism and externalism, I understand those. But the debates in epistemology have moved on, and I don't know how much those distinctions really matter as much, is kind of the impression I was getting.
Okay, I see. But you kind of understand like the whole reliabilism, proper function type of things, how they differ from like more deontic type of internalisms, which are like typical.
Exactly. And so I remember this. I mean, I've had this worry for several years. So I was at this conference with Charity Anderson, probably maybe even 10 years ago. And I was like, yeah, I really want like this proper functionalism, reliabilism, all that jazz. Let's go like full externalist. And she's like, oh yeah, no, I like all that. But we need evidence. And I'm like, well, I thought like, that's not how she's like, no, you can still be a hardcore evidentialist and affirm all these things. And I'm like, oh gosh. All right. So that's what I'm saying. Where I'm like, I don't know how much these distinctions matter as much anymore. Like, I feel like the conversations have moved on in epistemology and I've not bothered to keep up.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, there are like hybrids of like evidentialism and reliabilism. But the way that like I personally like to think about it is like internalism is more, it almost seems to require or is married to like a deontic view of like justification.
Yeah.
Like whereas you get away from like rules under externalism. So that's like one meaningful way I can make distinction between the two. And that's like how Platonius seems to think about it early on.
That was how we thought about it early on, but like Nicholas Wolterstorff, also doing the whole Reformed epistemology thing, Wolterstorff had some disagreements with Planck on this. So one of the things that Wolterstorff brings up he's got this collection of essays called The Practices of Belief. And it's a theme he brings up in a few of the essays, which is about what are your epistemic duties? And he looks at different time periods where, like in the Middle Ages, it would be like, everybody's got different epistemic duties. The Enlightenment, it was like, oh, everyone's got the same epistemic duties. And you're like, well, that's absurd. That, like we can't all have the same like epistemic obligations. And as Wolterstorff understood the whole Reformed epistemology movement was not saying we don't have any epistemic obligations, but that it's more person relative what those duties are.
Oh, I see.
So like like an example would be like like someone's moderating this chat. I'm not paying attention to it all. I have no like epistemic obligation to pay attention to it and be aware of what's happening in the chat, but somebody else does, and they're relying on their cognitive faculties to be truth aimed and in a good epistemic environment and all that, but they still have an epistemic obligation that I don't have.
Yeah, that makes sense. like I'm kind of attracted to a view in which there is no such thing as epistemic duty or even like justification, but still warrant would be a product of like a reliable, natural process. So that's why I can make sense of the distinction, at least insofar.
Yeah, no, I'm quite attracted to these ideas, but then, I'm also a teacher, and I look at my students and I'm like, no, you have epistemic obligations to me and to this class. Like, you will do this assignment, so some of my intuitions about warrant kind of go out the window when I step in the classroom.
You ever experienced like having the philosophy hat on and philosophy hat off? And so when you look at your students, kind of like the philosophy hat off.
Oh, all the time. One of my favorite, actually, this is kind of relevant to what we're talking about. So when I was teaching at Cambridge, like several years, like this was ages ago now, someone knocks on my door while I was like a couple hours before I'm getting ready to go give my lecture on religious epistemology. Someone knocks on my door and I answer it, and they're like, "Oh, I'm looking for Dr. Mullins." And I'm like, "I'm Dr. Mullins." And they're like, No, I'm looking for like Dr. Mullins. I'm like, "I am Dr. Mullins." And he's like, "You're not who I'm looking for. I'm so sorry." And he walks away. And I was like, am I in a real life Gettier case? Like, this guy comes up believing Dr. Mullins is in the room. And then he's like, oh, but he had someone else in mind. It was kind of weird.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
Right.
But yeah, I should definitely go though, because it is after midnight here.
Thank you for your time. It was nice.
Yeah, appreciate you coming, man.
Good talk.
All right,
Good talk.
All right, see you guys later.
Good night.
Yep.
Have a nice
All right,
one.
man. Yep. Take care.
Assalamu alaikum.